Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of the Missouri Ozarks. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time when you are listening to this narration. We are interested in knowing what places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the spring of 1908, the town of Oak Ridge, nestled in the remote valleys of the Missouri Ozarks, appeared on official maps as little more than a general store, a church, and a scattering of homesteads. The Springfield Republican newspaper occasionally mentioned the settlement in reports of agricultural yields or county politics, but otherwise, Oak Ridge maintained a determined isolation from the wider world. What those newspaper accounts failed to mention, what no official record acknowledged until decades later, was the existence of a substantial stone structure located 5 miles outside town limits, tucked into a narrow valley between limestone bluffs where the sun barely reached at midday. The Oak Ridge Asylum for the mentally disturbed operated without state oversight or medical licensing for nearly 20 years before its horrifying practices came to light. Dr. Silas Cranford, a tall, gaunt man with piercing eyes and immaculate attire, established the institution in 1889 after being dismissed from Washington University's medical program under circumstances deliberately obscured in official records. County documents discovered during a courthouse renovation in 1972 revealed Cranford purchased the 40-acre property with funds from several wealthy St. Louis families eager to remove troublesome relatives from public view. The asylum's remote location served multiple purposes. It kept patients far from prying eyes, discouraged unexpected visitors, and ensured that screams would go unheard by any save those already sworn to secrecy. The rugged Ozark landscape, with its dense forests, steep hillsides, and limited access roads, created a natural barrier that Cranford exploited fully in establishing his kingdom of suffering. Local residents, initially suspicious of the newcomer and his strange profession, soon discovered that the asylum's presence brought unprecedented prosperity to their struggling community. By 1908, when our story truly begins, the symbiotic relationship between town and asylum had calcified into a conspiracy of silence that would withstand even murder to maintain. Helena Pierce stepped off the dusty stagecoach into Oak Ridge on the 17th of April 1908, her urban attire marking her immediately as an outsider. The journey from St. Louis had taken 3 days, the last portion along narrow mountain roads that seemed deliberately designed to discourage visitors. According to her journal, recovered decades later from between the asylum walls, Pierce had received 5 letters over the preceding months, each more desperate than the last. The patient screamed through the night, one passage read, and returned from the basement changed, empty, their former selves scraped away like marrow from bone. Pierce had established herself at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch through fearless exposés of municipal corruption, but never had she encountered allegations as disturbing as those from her anonymous Oak Ridge correspondent. She checked into the town's only boarding house, a narrow 2-story structure operated by Martha Gaines, widow of a local logger. Pierce recorded that Gaines watched her with undisguised suspicion when she claimed to be searching for a cousin who might have been committed to a local institution. "No such place hereabouts that I know of," Gaines had replied, though her eyes darted briefly toward the northern hills. Pierce's journal documented similar responses from other townspeople over the following days. The general store owner changed the subject. The church minister suggested she return to St. Louis. The local sheriff, Jacob Holloway, informed her directly that strangers asking unusual questions weren't welcome in Oak Ridge. Yet Pierce observed telling details. New construction throughout the small town despite the national economic downturn, expensive goods in otherwise modest homes, and regular wagon traffic along a barely visible northern road. Most revealing was the conversation she overheard at the town's small cafe when 2 men discussed a delivery schedule to the doctor without realizing she sat in the adjacent booth. By April 23rd, Pierce had mapped the pattern of supply wagons, leaving town before dawn every Wednesday and Saturday, loaded with foodstuffs, linens, and wooden crates of unidentified contents. In her final journal entry from the boarding house, she wrote, "Tomorrow I follow the morning wagon. Something terrible hides in these hills, and the entire town conspires to conceal it. God help me, if they discover my true purpose. The prosperity of Oak Ridge existed entirely in the shadow of Dr. Cranford's asylum. Helena Pierce's methodical investigation, documented in her leather-bound journal, revealed a town utterly dependent on what locals euphemistically called the hospital. Ledgers from Mayor Thomas Grayson's general store, examined surreptitiously when the proprietor stepped away, showed monthly orders of unprecedented size: 50 pounds of coffee, 100-pound sacks of flour, crates of preserves, and medications not typically stocked in rural establishments. When confronted by Pierce posing as a curious visitor, Grayson offered vague explanations about supplying several outlying communities, though his discomfort was evident in his shifting gaze and perspiring brow. County financial records, preserved despite apparent attempts to purge them during the 1,940 seconds, revealed that by 1908, the asylum provided nearly 70% of Oak Ridge's economic activity. The blacksmith produced restraints and specialized tools under the guise of agricultural implements. The livery stable maintained a fleet of carriages specifically for transporting new patients, always arriving under cover of darkness. The town's 3 seamstresses sewed distinctive patient garments designed for easy restraint application. Most disturbing were the woodworkers' invoices for special containment furniture and therapeutic devices that, when sketched by Pierce based on descriptions, resembled medieval torture apparatus rather than medical equipment. The town's physician, Dr. Harold Mills, received quarterly payments from Cranford despite never visiting the asylum or treating its patients, an arrangement that appeared designed to purchase his professional silence. Interviews conducted in 1975 with elderly residents who had been children during the asylum's operation revealed how thoroughly the conspiracy permeated community life. Marjorie Winters, who had been 12 in 1908, recalled her father instructing her never to venture north of Oak Ridge and never to acknowledge the occasional screams carried on the night wind. "We didn't talk about it," she told researchers. "Not at school, not at church, not even at home. The adults would say, 'That's hospital business,' and change the subject. But we knew people went in and didn't come out. We knew our nice houses and full bellies came at a price. The whole town was guilty, every one of us." Helena Pierce departed her boarding house before dawn on April 24, 1908, following the weekly supply wagon at a discreet distance along a narrow dirt road that wound through dense oak forest. Her journal entry, penned later that night by candlelight, describes the 3-hour journey through increasingly rugged terrain before the trees suddenly gave way to reveal a valley enclosed by steep limestone cliffs. There, nestled against the northern rock face, stood a massive structure that seemed to emerge organically from the surrounding stone. The building appears designed to repel both escape and rescue, Pierce wrote, documenting its 3-story central administration block constructed of locally quarried limestone, flanked by 2 long single-story wings with barred windows barely larger than gun ports. A 10-foot stone wall surrounded the complex, topped with crude but effective iron spikes angled inward toward the grounds. Most surprising was the small powerhouse behind the main structure, housing what appeared to be an electrical generating system at least 15 years before such technology reached this remote region. Pierce observed the facility for 7 hours from a concealed position on the opposite ridge, noting details later confirmed by architectural studies conducted in 1964. The facility followed the Kirkbride plan popular for asylums in the late 19th century, but with significant modifications that prioritized security over therapeutic value. Guards armed with rifles patrolled the perimeter at 30-minute intervals, an unusual feature for a medical facility. Most telling was the absence of patients in the exercise yard despite the mild spring weather, suggesting those confined within rarely, if ever, saw daylight. Pierce's journal records counting 14 barred windows along the eastern wing, each with the same motionless silhouette visible through the glass, a single chair facing the wall rather than the window. "This is no hospital," she concluded in her notes, "but a fortress designed to contain human beings while something unspeakable happens to them within those walls." As dusk approached, Pierce observed a disturbing ritual. A bell rang, and immediately every window in both wings went dark simultaneously, though lights in the administrative section burned late into the night. "I must find a way inside," Her journal entry concludes, "Though I confess the prospect fills me with more dread than I have ever known." Before venturing further into the asylum investigation, Helena Pierce returned briefly to Street Louis to research Dr. Silas Cranford's past, a journey documented in letters to her editor dated early May 1908. University archives revealed Cranford had once been considered a promising medical talent, graduating near the top of his class in 1879. His academic papers from this period, preserved in university collections, showed early signs of his later obsessions, with titles such as Surgical Interventions for Moral Insanity and Physical Foundations of Mental Aberration. A former colleague, Dr. William Thatcher, reluctantly recounted to Pierce how Cranford's methods grew increasingly extreme during his residency at Missouri State Hospital. He became convinced that the frontal portions of the brain housed what he called centers of deviance that could be surgically modified, Thatcher explained, describing how Cranford was dismissed after performing unauthorized procedures on 5 patients, 2 of whom died while 3 were rendered into compliant, emotionless shells. Medical board records indicated Cranford's license was revoked in 1882, though he continued to present himself as a doctor. Most disturbing were accounts from 3 former asylum attendants who had worked briefly under Cranford in his early years at Oak Ridge. They described a tall, slender man with impeccable posture and formal speech, always dressed in black suits regardless of the weather or setting. He could be charming when needed, one attendant told Pierce, especially when wealthy families arrived with troublesome relatives, but his eyes never matched his smile, cold like a snake's, calculating. All 3 attendants mentioned Cranford's peculiar habit of watching patients for hours without speaking, making notes in a leather journal, particularly after they'd undergone what he termed corrective procedures. Former nurse Margaret Holloway recounted how Cranford spoke of his patients as fascinating specimens rather than people, and described brain tissue as clay to be remolded by skilled hands. The most chilling detail emerged from Cranford's own writings, discovered in a Street Louis medical library. When conventional medicine rejected my methods, I realized society was not prepared for necessary advances. True progress requires isolation from interference, a laboratory where nature's mistakes in human development can be corrected without sentimental obstruction. I shall create such a place. Helena Pierce returned to Oak Ridge on May 12, approaching the asylum directly with forged credentials from St. Louis General Hospital. Her journal describes the long walk up the gravel path to the main entrance, noting how the building seemed to absorb sound, creating an unnatural silence broken only by the crunch of her footsteps. The heavy oak doors opened to reveal a surprisingly elegant foyer with polished floors and oak paneling that contrasted sharply with the fortress-like exterior. Gerald Whitby, the administrative director, received her in an office decorated only with military commendations and anatomical drawings of the human brain. Pierce described Whitby as a man carved from stone, his posture rigid, his gray mustache precisely trimmed, his eyes evaluating me like a piece of equipment rather than a person. Her questions about treatment protocols were met with vague references to progressive methodologies and permanent solutions to persistent conditions. When she inquired about patient care standards, Whitby responded that the asylum prioritized results over comfort and required staff with strong constitutions and unwavering discretion. Most telling was Whitby's statement that new employees were prohibited from discussing their work outside the facility, with dismissal being the least severe consequence for breaking this rule. Pierce's journal recounts being offered a position immediately, with unusual emphasis placed on her willingness to assist with special procedures in the lower levels. The subsequent tour included only the administrative wing, though Pierce documented hearing sounds from behind closed doors that she described as neither fully human nor recognizably animal. A keening that raised the hair on my neck. Staff, encountered during her visit, displayed an unusual uniformity in behavior, speaking only when addressed and avoiding eye contact with both Pierce and each other. Most disturbing was the glimpse she caught through a partially open door, where a young male attendant was methodically strapping down a patient while another prepared a tray of surgical instruments. Pierce's journal entry concludes with her acceptance of the nursing position and her growing certainty that, quote, something monstrous occurs in this place, something that strips away not just freedom, but humanity itself. God forgive me, but I must witness it firsthand to expose it. Helena Pierce began her employment at Oak Ridge Asylum on May 15, 1908, assigned to the Women's Wing, where she quickly established herself as efficient and unquestioning. Her journal entries from this period reveal her strategic efforts to access patient records, befriending Martha Wilson, an elderly clerk responsible for maintaining admission documents. Through careful conversation and after-hours investigation of filing cabinets left unlocked, Pierce gradually assembled a disturbing picture of the asylum's true purpose. Patient ledgers revealed that families from across Missouri, Illinois, and Arkansas paid between $500 and $2,000 annually to commit relatives to Cranford's care, sums equivalent to several years' wages for average workers. The diagnoses listed in these records revealed the asylum's actual function: female hysteria, for women who sought divorce or property rights; adolescent defiance disorder, for children who questioned parental authority; political monomania, for labor organizers and suffragettes; sexual inversion, for those with unconventional romantic attachments. Pierce documented conversations with attendant Samuel Hayes, who candidly admitted that fewer than 1 in 5 patients exhibited symptoms that might genuinely indicate mental illness. "Most are just inconvenient to somebody with money," Hayes told her during a late-night shift. "The banker's daughter who got pregnant, the wife who discovered her husband's embezzlement, the son who refuses to enter the family business." Patient files contained revealing correspondence from families, with phrases like "must be made manageable" and "require her compliance upon return" appearing frequently. Most chilling were Cranford's notations regarding treatment goals that included elimination of rebellious tendencies and inducement of docility. Records recovered decades later confirmed Pierce's findings, revealing that between 1,889 and 1,908, over 200 individuals were committed to Cranford's care, many disappearing entirely from public record afterward. The asylum operated as a shadow legal system, where unwanted persons could be effectively imprisoned without trial or appeal, their very identities erased once they passed through the heavy oak doors. "This place," Pierce wrote, "exists not to heal the ill but to punish the inconvenient, a repository for those whose only true affliction is their incongruence with others' expectations. What happens to them within these walls is not treatment but erasure." After 3 weeks of careful observation and strategic befriending of staff, Helena Pierce convinced Ellis Gardner, an elderly janitor with rheumatic hands, to grant her access to the basement level, ostensibly to retrieve additional linens. Her journal entry dated June 2, 1908, records her descent down narrow stone steps lit by electric bulbs, a luxury unavailable in most rural Missouri communities. The basement corridor extended beneath both wings, lined with heavy metal doors bearing only numbers rather than names. The first unlocked room contained what Pierce described as a museum of horrors masquerading as science. Glass jars of preserved brain sections, each meticulously labeled with patient numbers and behavioral notes. Adjacent shelves held photographic plates documenting surgical procedures, the subject's eyes wide with terror rather than dulled by anesthesia. A central operating theater dominated the largest chamber, equipped with drainage channels cut into the stone floor leading to collection basins where tissue samples could be preserved. Leather restraints showed evidence of desperate struggles, with deep scratches in the wood beneath them where fingernails had carved final protests. Most revealing was the locked cabinet Pierce managed to access, containing Dr. Cranford's research journals dating back to 1889. These detailed his systematic approach to cerebral modification, beginning with crude surgical removal of brain tissue and progressing to more targeted electrical stimulation of specific regions. Patient 117's file documented a once violent patient rendered perpetually docile though requiring feeding assistance following removal of portions of the frontal lobe. Patient 142, previously afflicted with homosexual tendencies, underwent 37 sessions of electrical stimulation until displaying appropriate response to female presence. Pierce discovered Cranford's magnum opus in progress, a comprehensive theory of behavioral restructuring through physical intervention, arguing that personality, morality, and identity resided in physically alterable brain structures. His notes revealed a man convinced of his own genius, untroubled by the suffering his work entailed. I witnessed 3 orderlies bringing a struggling young woman down the stairs, Pierce wrote in her final entry that night. She fought with such desperation, somehow knowing what waited in these rooms. Dr. Cranford emerged from his office, observed her resistance with academic interest, and simply noted, "Another specimen requiring comprehensive reconstruction. I must act soon, before I too become a subject of his monstrous research." The night shift revealed horrors that daylight concealed. Helena Pierce requested night duty beginning June 5th, writing that darkness strips away pretense, revealing truths too terrible for sunlight. Her journal documents methodical observations from midnight until dawn, describing conditions that violated every principle of medical ethics and basic humanity. Each narrow cell contained only an iron bed frame and bucket, their occupants classified by colored armbands: blue for new arrivals still possessing awareness and personality, yellow for those undergoing treatment cycles, red for the successfully modified whose vacant eyes reflected interior emptiness. Pierce recorded patient 173, a woman committed for excessive literary pursuits and rejection of marital obligations who spent 12 hours daily strapped to a chair facing the wall, a procedure Cranford termed reflection therapy, designed to eliminate independent thought patterns. In the hydrotherapy room, Pierce witnessed attendants submerging struggling patients in ice water until consciousness faded, a process repeated until the fight leaves them permanently, as one orderly explained. Most disturbing were patients returning from basement sessions, their scalps freshly bandaged, movements uncoordinated, speech reduced to monosyllables if they spoke at all. Patient 189, identified in records as a former schoolteacher who had organized for labor rights, returned from the basement unable to recognize alphabetic symbols or form complete sentences. Patient 204, previously described in admission records as violently opposed to father's business practices, now shuffled through halls empty-eyed, following simple commands with mechanical precision, occasionally touching the surgical scars hidden beneath his hair with expression of confused loss. Pierce's documentation grew increasingly frantic as she observed patterns in staff turnover, noting how attendants who questioned procedures were assigned to special observation duty in the basement, never to return to regular shifts. "I sense watchful eyes tracking my movements," she wrote on June 10th. "Whitby studies me during shift changes. And Doctor? Cranford asked pointed questions about my nursing experience today. Last night, I found my journal moved from its hiding place beneath the floorboard, though nothing was taken. How much longer can I maintain this facade before joining those empty-eyed souls shuffling down the corridors? Yet I cannot leave without evidence substantial enough to force authorities to act." Helena Pierce realized that exposing the asylum's atrocities required allies, a dangerous necessity in a town where every shadow seemed to report to Dr. Cranford. Her journal entries from mid-June detail careful approaches to potential confidants during her limited time away from the facility. Reverend Thomas Blackwell initially appeared sympathetic when Pierce spoke vaguely of concerning conditions at a medical facility, but upon specific mention of Cranford's asylum, his demeanor transformed instantly. "We don't discuss hospital business," he stated flatly, eyes darting to the church's new stained-glass windows installed. Pierce later learned, with a substantial donation from Cranford himself. Dr. Joseph Miller, in neighboring Forsyth, proved similarly compromised, his new medical practice partially funded by private investors from Oak Ridge. Pierce documented how conversation after conversation followed the same pattern: initial interest dissolving into fear or hostility once they realized her true concerns. The telegraph operator, William Finch, proved her sole potential ally. Working late one evening, Finch confided that his cousin Sarah had been committed to Cranford's care in 1904 for excessive melancholy following her fiancé's death. After 6 months, the family received notice of Sarah's passing from complications of treatment. Her body returned with unexplained surgical scars crossing her skull. Finch agreed to send encoded telegrams to Pierce's editor in St. Louis, using innocuous language about fabric shipments to convey information about patient numbers and procedures. Pierce's journal grows increasingly urgent during this period, recording suspicious incidents suggesting her cover was weakening. Her boarding house room had been searched while she worked. Attendants fell silent when she entered asylum rooms. Administrator Whitby began questioning her about her background, claiming inconsistencies in her references. Most alarming was her encounter with Dr. Cranford himself on June 18th, when he commented, "You observe more carefully than most nurses, Miss Pierce. Such curiosity is admirable in proper contexts, dangerous in others." In her final journal entry before arranging the escape attempt, Pierce wrote, "Time contracts around me like a noose. Eyes follow my movements. Questions await my answers. I feel the asylum's machinery turning gradually in my direction, the same gears that have ground so many others to emptiness." Helena Pierce's coded journal entries from late June outline the escape plan conceived after William Finch identified Elizabeth Calloway as their best hope for exposing the asylum's horrors. Calloway, a 27-year-old former accountant, had been committed 6 months earlier after discovering discrepancies in her husband's business ledgers suggesting embezzlement. Still possessing her faculties, despite 2 sessions in Cranford's basement laboratory, Calloway had access to the women's exercise yard, where a section of wall remained partially obscured from guard towers by overgrown elm trees. Pierce documented their preparations with methodical precision. The orderly Daniel Matthews bribed with $20 to leave a service door unlocked. The timing coordinated with shift changes at 2 a.m. when surveillance was minimized, the planned route through dense woods to a waiting horse Finch would provide. On the night of June 23rd, Pierce administered mild sedatives to patients who might raise alarms, then used her duplicate keys to access Calloway's cell. The escape proceeded according to plan until they reached the woods beyond the asylum grounds. Calloway, weakened by weeks of restricted nourishment and the effects of electrical treatments to her frontal lobe, collapsed after less than a mile. Pierce's journal describes the agonizing decision to leave Calloway hidden in a shallow ravine while seeking Finch and the promised transportation. Upon reaching the rendezvous point, Pierce found no sign of Finch or the horse, only disturbed earth suggesting a struggle. Returning to Calloway required 3 hours of searching in near-total darkness, by which time the patient had vanished, leaving only footprints indicating she had been discovered and dragged back toward the asylum. Pierce returned to her boarding house before dawn, finding the door unlocked and her few possessions thoroughly searched. Finch failed to appear at the telegraph office the following day, the station master explaining he had been suddenly called away on family matters without further elaboration. Pierce's final independent journal entry reads, "The circle tightens. Matthews refused to meet my eyes during morning rounds. Whitby smiled when he saw me, a predator's recognition of trapped prey. Every door I pass through may be the last I enter willingly." If these words are found, know that what happens in Oak Ridge Asylum is not treatment, but methodical destruction of human souls, and an entire community stands complicit in monstrous silence. On July 2nd, 1908, James Harrington, senior editor at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, received the last telegraphed message from Helena Pierce, a cryptic note about fabric patterns requiring further study, that he recognized as their established code indicating significant discoveries. When subsequent communications ceased, Harrington's initial irritation transformed gradually to concern, as documented in the newspaper's internal correspondence preserved in their archives. By July 12th, having received no response to 3 telegrams, Harrington dispatched a formal letter to Oak Ridge's postmaster inquiring about Pierce's whereabouts. The response, dated July 18th, claimed simply that Pierce had departed town without forwarding address, a claim repeated with suspicious uniformity by the telegraph operator, boarding house owner, and local sheriff. Harrington's growing alarm prompted a series of increasingly urgent communications, culminating in his personal visit to Oak Ridge on August 3rd, where he encountered a community united in polite obstruction. Sheriff Walter Jenkins informed Harrington that his jurisdiction ended at the town limits and that the northern hills where Pierce allegedly had last been seen fell under county authority. The county sheriff's office in turn explained that without evidence of foul play, A grown woman choosing to leave her employment constituted no crime worth investigating. The Post-Dispatch's publisher, concerned about allocation of resources during tight financial times, denied Harrington's request to assign another reporter to investigate Pierce's disappearance, suggesting instead that she had likely accepted a position with a competing newspaper. Harrington's personal journal, donated to the Missouri Historical Society after his death in 1936, reveals his deepening frustration and helplessness as official avenues closed one by one. "Something terrible happens in Oak Ridge," he wrote on August 10th. "Something Helena discovered and likely fell victim to. Yet I face a wall of silence more impenetrable than mere conspiracy could maintain. This is fear, collective and absolute." His final letter to Missouri's governor requesting state investigation received a perfunctory response citing lack of jurisdiction and insufficient evidence. By September, Pierce's position at the newspaper had been filled, her disappearance reduced to an occasional conversation among colleagues, while in Oak Ridge, Dr. Cranford's work continued uninterrupted behind limestone walls. The fate of Helena Pierce emerges through clinical documents discovered in a sealed records room during the 1964 investigation, revealing the terrible transformation of investigator to subject. Admitted on June 24, 1908, as patient #217, her intake forms list Jane Smith, though Cranford's handwritten notation acknowledges her true identity. Journalist H.P., presenting with delusional paranoia and dangerous obsession with institutional practices. Unique opportunity for comprehensive personality reconstruction. The admission was authorized by Sheriff Jenkins, who certified her as a danger to community stability. Pierce somehow maintained a fragmented journal during her initial confinement, writing on scraps hidden in her mattress. Seized while returning to boarding house. No formal charges, no outside communication permitted. "Other patients recognize me, but staff pretend I have always been patient 217. Cranford's treatment notes document a methodical approach to breaking Pierce's identity. Beginning with isolation therapy in the basement's darkened cells, subject maintains journalistic delusions after 72 hours sensory restriction. Escalation to physical intervention indicated. Pierce's corresponding entry shows deteriorating handwriting. Darkness absolute. Water provided irregularly. Disorientation growing. Must remember my purpose. Must remember Helena Pierce exists." By July 7th, clinical notes record, first surgical intervention successful. Removed tissue from left prefrontal region. Subject displays reduced verbal resistance and diminished recall of investigative purpose. Pierce's journal fragments become increasingly disjointed. Something missing. Thoughts slip away before completion. Dreams of Street Lewis fading. Was I truly a journalist? The final clinical entries detail escalating procedures. Electrical stimulation of remaining brain tissue, chemical suppression of memory formation, and eventually a comprehensive bilateral lobotomy on August 3rd. Procedure yields optimal outcome, Cranford wrote. Subject now displays appropriate docility, minimal self-directed thought, and no recognition of former identity or purpose. Journalist effectively eliminated, while biological functions preserved for ongoing study of long-term personality reconstruction. Pierce's final journal entry, dated July 28th, consists of increasingly shaky script. Cannot hold thoughts. Name is Helena. I am Helena. I was Helena. I was something important. I knew things that mattered. I was sent to find what happens in the basement. The basement is where they take people who remember too much. They're coming to take me again. If found, please tell Harrington that I discovered what happens to... Flames erupted from the eastern wing of Oak Ridge Asylum at approximately 2:17 a.m. on September 18, 1908, according to the night watchman's log recovered from administrative records. The Springfield Republican reported the incident 3 days later as a tragic accident at a private sanitarium, noting that cooking equipment mishandled by patients had caused the conflagration. Insurance documents filed by Dr. Cranford claimed $27,000 in damages while reporting that regrettable casualties occurred despite staff heroism. County death certificates, issued without formal inquiries, listed 27 patients and 3 staff members as victims. their remains buried in a common grave on asylum grounds without family notification. Yet conflicting accounts emerged through interviews conducted decades later with surviving staff members. Night attendant Frederick Collins, interviewed in 1961, described seeing flashes of light in the women's ward moments before the alarm, noting that the fire spread with suspicious rapidity that suggested accelerants. The Eastern Wing, where the most intensive treatment cases were housed, included Helena Pierce's assigned ward, raising questions about her possible involvement despite her documented lobotomy procedures. Asylum records show patient #217 among the survivors, transferred to the undamaged Western Wing following the fire. Most significant were the statements from Howard Jenkins, a junior insurance investigator whose personal papers, discovered after his death in 1959, described his team's brief access to the facility during damage assessment. "We were strictly confined to the burned wing and administrative offices," Jenkins wrote, yet even this limited exposure revealed disturbing inconsistencies. Patient rooms resembled prison cells rather than medical accommodations. Several contained restraint apparatus bolted to walls and floors. Most troubling was the reinforced door leading to basement levels that Cranford insisted remained undamaged and thus outside our inspection authority. The fire marked the first external scrutiny of Cranford's operation, though his political connections ensured investigations remained superficial. The official report concluded that, while facility conditions appear austere by urban standards, they remain appropriate for the specialized care provided. Yet Jenkins noted in his private correspondence that something profoundly wrong permeates that place. "We glimpsed only shadows of practices that I suspect would horrify civilized society if fully illuminated." The Missouri State Medical Board's investigation of Oak Ridge Asylum began on November 12, 1908, when 3 inspectors arrived unannounced following concerns raised in the insurance report. Their timing proved unfortunate, as early winter storms had already made the mountain roads treacherous, limiting their initial visit to a single day before weather forced their return to Springfield. Dr. Cranford presented carefully selected patient files, showing conventional treatments while explaining that, unfortunately, many detailed records were lost in the recent fire. State archives document the investigators' growing frustration during subsequent visits as witnesses repeatedly became unavailable or contradicted previous precise statements. Night attendant Sarah Wilson initially described patients kept in prolonged isolation but recanted the next day, her eyes downcast as she claimed misunderstanding of proper procedures. Investigators noted numerous technical violations including inadequate sanitation, improper medication storage, and insufficient qualified medical personnel, yet their authority extended only to administrative penalties rather than criminal charges. Their most promising evidence came from former attendant Michael Richards, who had fled to Kansas City after the fire and provided sworn testimony about patients subjected to experimental surgeries without consent and the systematic falsification of death certificates. Without corroborating physical evidence or witness statements, however, these remained unproven allegations. Correspondence between Cranford and State Senator William Harrison, recovered from the senator's papers in 1981, reveals the doctor's methodical approach to undermining the investigation, including campaign contributions to key officials and invocation of influential patients' family names. Most effective was Cranford's strategic response to preliminary findings, voluntarily reducing patient numbers from 163 to 78, modifying the most visible procedural violations, and agreeing to quarterly inspections that he correctly anticipated would become increasingly perfunctory as public attention waned. The final report, issued February 1909, cited Oak Ridge Asylum for 27 regulatory violations, resulting in fines totaling $1,200, but permitting continued operation under provisional certification, requiring minimal modifications to physical facilities and record-keeping practices. Within 6 months, inspection visits had become predictable formalities announced weeks in advance, allowing Cranford to resume modified versions of his experimental work in newly constructed basement facilities while maintaining a superficial compliance with state regulations. Between 1909 and 1914, Oak Ridge Asylum withered like a diseased limb. Its decline, documented through quarterly inspection reports and town financial records preserved in county archives. Following the state investigation, legitimate mental institutions across Missouri began refusing transfer agreements with Cranford's facility, effectively stemming the flow of new patients while families with relatives already committed began withdrawing them when possible. Ledgers from Mayor Grayson's general store show steadily decreasing orders for asylum supplies, declining approximately 12% annually over this period. Dr. Cranford's response appears in Asylum financial records, where patient fees increased from $500 annually in 1909 to nearly $1,200 by 1913, while staff wages were repeatedly reduced and basic necessities such as heating, fuel, and dietary provisions were severely rationed. Former nurse Abigail Williams, interviewed in 1970, recalled this period as a slow descent into something worse than the previous horrors. Before, there was at least a perverse order to the cruelty. During the decline, it became unpredictable, desperate. Williams described patients confined to beds for days without attention, developing infections and pressure wounds that often proved fatal. Cemetery records recovered from groundskeeper Timothy Hayes show an increasing mortality rate, with 37 patients buried in unmarked graves between 1,909 and 1,914, their deaths attributed to natural causes, despite many being under 40 years of age. The asylum's deterioration rippled through Oak Ridge's economy, evident in tax records showing multiple business closures and property foreclosures as the town's primary revenue source contracted. By 1914, only 17 patients remained at the facility, all long-term cases whose families had either died or deliberately severed contact. Most disturbing were accounts of Dr. Cranford's personal transformation during this period. Once meticulously groomed and articulate, witnesses described him becoming increasingly disheveled, prone to monologues about unrecognized medical genius, and observed self-administering experimental compounds developed in his laboratories. Administrator Whitby's resignation letter from December 1913 cited increasingly erratic leadership and untenable risk to reputation as his reasons for departure, leaving Cranford with a skeleton staff of just 7 employees to maintain the crumbling institution and its remaining residents. The blizzard descended on January 7, 1915, burying the mountain roads beneath 4 feet of snow and sealing Oak Ridge Asylum from outside contact for 17 days, according to meteorological records from Springfield. The subsequent coroner's investigation, documented in county archives recovered in 1967, assembled a horrifying chronology through physical evidence and the fractured testimony of caretaker Harold Wilson, the sole survivor. Wilson's statement described how supplies dwindled rapidly, with coal reserves exhausted by January 12, forcing patients and remaining staff to cluster in the administrative wing, where Dr. Cranford maintained a wood-burning stove in his office. The final days unfolded through forensic evidence collected from the scene, bloody surgical instruments discovered throughout the building rather than confined to operating areas, suggesting procedures performed wherever patients could be restrained, multiple syringes containing unidentified compounds that subsequent analysis revealed to be combinations of morphine, experimental psychoactive substances, and chemicals typically used for specimen preservation. Patient restraints fashioned from torn bedding when standard equipment proved insufficient for Cranford's accelerating work. Wilson's testimony described Cranford as possessed by feverish purpose, performing continuous surgeries without sleep while documenting observations in journals with increasingly illegible handwriting and disconnected thoughts. By January 20th, according to Wilson, attendants James Foster and Elizabeth Chambers had hanged themselves in the kitchen pantry after witnessing procedures Wilson would only describe as unholy violations of human form. When authorities finally reached the facility on January 24th, they discovered 14 patients dead from combinations of surgical trauma, exposure, and apparent chemical injections. Patient #217, identified in earlier records as former journalist Helena Pierce, was found in Cranford's private examination room, her brain cavity open and empty, meticulous drawings of her neural structure covering the surrounding walls. Cranford himself lay dead at his desk, a self-administered injection still protruding from his arm, surrounded by journals containing what the coroner's report described as the deranged documentation of a mind collapsed into its own grotesque ambitions. Wilson, found huddled in the basement coal room, could only repeat disconnectedly. He said he finally understood. He said the storm was perfect timing. He said history would recognize his work once he completed the final synthesis. The systematic erasure of Oak Ridge Asylum began within days of the 1915 tragedy, orchestrated with the same community-wide complicity that had enabled its operation. County commissioners ordered all official references to the facility struck from records, the building itself dismantled stone by stone during the spring of 1916, with materials repurposed throughout the region to eliminate physical evidence of its existence. Newspaper accounts of the deaths were carefully worded to suggest a private sanitarium had closed following unfortunate but natural deaths during winter isolation, while town meetings established a code of silence succinctly expressed by Mayor Grayson. What's buried stays buried. This collective amnesia succeeded for nearly 5 decades until 1964, when University of Missouri historian Dr. Margaret Wilkins discovered insurance claim references while researching healthcare development in rural Missouri. Her subsequent investigation encountered extraordinary resistance, from denied access to county archives to thinly veiled threats when she began interviewing elderly residents. Persistence eventually revealed the asylum's foundations, visible only as moss-covered stones in a clearing surrounded by encroaching forest, and the adjacent patient cemetery where ground-penetrating radar identified 172 unmarked graves. Most significant was the discovery of a metal box sealed within the remaining cornerstone, containing Helena Pierce's complete journal alongside Dr. Cranford's final research notes, providing irrefutable documentation of the atrocities committed under institutional sanction. The revelation fractured Oak Ridge's carefully maintained silence, dividing descendants of those involved between demands for acknowledgement and continued calls for privacy. The memorial, finally established in 2005, a simple stone wall bearing the names of identified victims, stands as testimony to both the specific horrors of Cranford's asylum and the broader dangers of unchecked authority operating beyond oversight. Descendants of patients still occasionally visit, placing flowers beside names of relatives who disappeared into institutional shadows, their true fates concealed for generations. The hidden asylum reminds us how readily human rights can be sacrificed to convenience, how economic incentives can silence moral objections, and how easily cruelty becomes routine when cloaked in authority's mantle. The Ozarks landscape itself seems complicit, its isolated valleys and protective ridges creating perfect harbors for secrets too terrible for light. Travelers passing through modern Oak Ridge note the unusual quiet that descends as they cross certain boundaries, a silence deep enough to swallow screams, persistent enough to muffle history, yet insufficient to truly bury the past.